I get emails or maybe DMs frequently from viewers who are curious whether their city maybe justifies a BRT or perhaps even a rail line. And it might surprise you, but my response to these questions is actually the exact same as my response to transit agency CEOs suggesting they need to cut service to better match demand. As it turns out, there's a bit of a secret in transit and more broadly transportation that throws all of these assumptions for a loop. And today, I'm going to talk all about it. Probably the most well-known element of pop urban transportation discussion is the idea around induced demand. But I think that far too often people don't consider the fundamental underlying logic that underpins the idea of induced demand. An idea that applies a lot more broadly than just to urban roadways. And that's the idea that transportation, and more specifically transit demand, is not fixed. So a city being large or dense is not the only factor in whether public transportation systems can be successful or viable. The truth is that demand for transit is dependent on a lot of different factors, from frequency to how comfortable it is. Of course, not all of these factors weigh evenly, but they do definitely all have an impact. And sometimes how much they matter is variable on how extreme of a case we're talking about. For example, the cleanliness of a train probably doesn't matter all that much if it's just slightly dusty, but a very gross train might have a serious impact on people's willingness to ride transit. At the same time, people probably don't care all that much if the bus they're riding has a couple seats free versus no seats free, as long as they get to sit. But the second they start having to stand for over an hour, they're really going to be thinking twice about getting on that bus route. A good starting point here is to consider that in any urban area, there's always going to be varying demand for different types of trips. And of course, everyone needs to decide how they're going to actually make those trips. Various elements of a transit service are going to modify the viability or suitability of that service, as well as the attractiveness to actually serve the trips that people want to make. And of course, this is a complicated thing because it's a self-dependent system. It's not at all uncommon for someone's travel decisions to be influenced by the travel that they can actually easily do. If there's a direct flight from your city to a certain other city, it's a lot more likely you're going to travel there for vacation than a city where there isn't a direct flight. And similar logic applies on a micro level to day-to-day transportation decisions. Imagine if you're thinking about what to do on the weekend or after work. You're a lot more likely to go to a trendy cafe if it's easy for you to get to it on public transportation versus if it's not. And if you really want to go to that cafe and it's easy to drive but not to take transit, well, that's going to influence your decision to drive. This is why the frequency, ease of use, speed, and comfort of public transportation is so important, because it can actually play in heavily to the demand for that same transit service. This is in many ways different for how demand for driving works. If you drive, you probably already own a car, and so that cost is sunk. At the same time, the actual comfort of driving is highly dependent on the car you own. It's something that's fixed once you own a particular car. The car you have is the car you have. By comparison, the quality of transit, often referred to as the level of service, is highly dependent on decisions made by the transit agency. It's a lot more variable, and there are a lot more levers which can be pulled. What's interesting is that the way that transit and automobility respond to congestion is basically the opposite of how their actual quality is determined. Which is why that despite the fact that induced demand is something which does exist for highways and subways, we really only tend to talk about it for highways. While the actual quality and attractiveness of a transit service being put out is highly variable, by comparison with driving, the actual quality of transit is rarely that variable with respect to how congested it is. A busy bus or train tends to go mostly as fast as one that's almost empty. This is sort of the opposite of how road congestion works. When the roads get busier, your car doesn't get full of people and suddenly much less comfortable, but your travel time does get a lot slower. And it's worth actually thinking about how carpool and HOV lanes play into that, and how that dynamic works when compared to how transit works under high loads. Anyways, the independence between demand and travel time is one of the key elements of mass transit. And I'd argue it's a big part of what makes it so attractive when compared to driving, at least when you're not in farm country and actually in a big city. Getting back to the issue of, does my city justify? That of course depends. transit demand is likely going to be some subset of overall transportation demand. And if you're in a city with even just tens of thousands of people, that's a lot of demand for various trips. People have to get to work or school, see friends or family, and do errands and regular appointments. So if transit can be a compelling option for even just 10% of people's trips, that's a lot of trips to serve. That means that even a small city could justify a high-level transit service, like the city of Lausanne in Switzerland, which has a metro system, despite having around 120,000 people. Because sometimes if you can provide a compelling enough service that meets the needs of enough trips, well, you can justify intense transit service even in a small place. A better question than does my city justify is, does my city have corridors where the transportation demand is high enough that with a high quality transit service, we can justify the existence of said transit service with the ridership it will generate? A great example of just how important this is the comparison between Vancouver, BC and Portland, Oregon that I so often make on the channel, at least historically. You see, there's a big question that comes out of these two similarly sized Pacific Northwest cities. For one, how does Vancouver, being the same size as Portland, justify a full subway when Portland can only justify light rail? And for two, how is Vancouver's rail system around 4 times more heavily used than Portland's? Well, you might suggest that the reason Vancouver can justify a subway is because, well, it has 4 times the ridership of Portland. But I'd argue that the mode and ridership are a lot more closely intertwined. A big part of why Vancouver has higher ridership is because it chose a transit mode that can provide a higher level of service. Now, of course, there are other differences between the cities, and some of those are push factors, so to speak. For example, in Vancouver, there is a lot less highway to get you to the city center. In fact, there's no highway to get you to the city center, and in general, roadways are quite heavily congested, at least relative to Portland. At the same time, the heavy taxes on fuel in Vancouver mean that driving a car that's powered by gas is expensive even for Canada, not to mention Oregon. Of course, though, there aren't only push factors, there are also pull factors. For example, Vancouver runs faster and more frequent service than Portland does. So travel times on transit broadly are just much more competitive with driving than with Portland, and this means that more people's trips make sense on transit. What's interesting though is that you can also compare other factors. It's pretty obvious that if you had the same transit service, if it costs less, it's going to be more attractive, leaving aside any crazy behavioral economics. But what's interesting is that when you compare Vancouver to Portland, you realize that transit fares in Vancouver are basically universally higher, and that's in a city where people tend to be less well off. And so what this suggests to me is that a lot of transit riders are willing to pay for higher levels of service. And inversely, just having lower fares isn't going to get you more ridership than good service, which appears to be the most important factor to driving ridership. Unsurprising if you've watched the channel for a long time. And of course, the factors which influence demand aren't all internal to transit. More supportive land use, like you see in Vancouver with high-rise apartments near mini stations, certainly doesn't hurt. But what's important to remember is just like with ridership, land use depends on the transportation provision. Because Vancouver's rail transit generally provides a higher level of service, and because it has roughly 50% as many stations as in Portland, there's just a lot more value in the specific station sites, which encourages higher densities. Of course, when you take the thinking around getting more people on transit and influencing demand, you eventually hit a wall. If 100% of trips are being made on transit, you can't exactly easily increase the transit mode share. But that's rarely the case, and you can always increase the number of trips being made by making new trips more attractive. Speaking of that, we have one of the trickiest elements of transit planning, how to actually know what the demand for transit is. One method used in Vancouver is to provide higher levels of transit service on corridors that are thought to be of significant regional importance. This additional service, generally in the form of Beeline or now rapid bus service, creates a virtuous cycle where more people want to live and locate employment along transit corridors, and this increases demand for transportation. Of course, that also increases congestion, which only makes transit a more attractive option. And if you have a rapid bus service that more or less stops in the same places where you would put stations on a future rapid transit rail line, well, you can start to get a pretty good sense for the amount of people who'd be willing to ride such a line. That being said, it's important to know that this method can only take you so far. Sometimes the only way to truly know how much demand there is for a certain transit project is to make a big investment. For example, picture London. It's clear that London has a lot of east-west travel demand, with the District Line and the congested Central Line of the Tube. And so, of course, more services make sense, but you can't easily determine the viability or ridership potential for a project like Crossrail by trying to replicate it with an overground bus route, or even on existing rail lines. That corridor and that infrastructure just doesn't exist right now. Of course, the Central Line is probably a better analog for the future Crossrail project than a bus service ever would be anyways, but in some cases you just have to try to create good models and predictions for how much ridership will be. But that's incredibly complicated. Transportation networks aren't simple. For example, creating a new line might decongest an existing one, making it a more attractive travel option for trips you didn't even expect existed. Sometimes you just have to build to see what will specifically happen, and you can actually see this with the Elizabeth line. We got to see it open last year and it seemed like a really good service, but as it turns out, ridership has been much higher than expected, which means the project likely generates even more utility and transportation value than planners expected. Getting back to the idea of transit agency CEOs, the first thing you should do when you see transit being operated that isn't getting as much use as you would like isn't to leap to the idea that transit is just over-provisioned. We're probably running too many buses. The reason for this is because reducing service, pulling that lever so to speak, is the most likely one to have a detrimental impact on transit demand. So reducing service is going to have an immediate impact on the amount of people that actually want to use the service. Instead, you should probably start with the less influential levers. For example, am I providing service in the right place? Is the service fast, comfortable, and convenient? Because the solution to getting more people on transit is never to make it slower by making it less frequent. Thanks for watching.